You ever wonder why even when the Democrats have power, they still struggle to get things done? They make all these big promises during election season: healthcare for all, tackling climate change, criminal justice reform, and then what happens? A lot of those promises seem to get lost in the noise. Let's just say the answer is way more complicated than Republicans are blocking everything. It's way deeper than that. First things first, let's talk about the elephant in the room. No, not the Republicans. We'll get to them later. The real struggle starts inside the Democratic Party itself. The Democrats aren't one big happy family. They're more like a family reunion where no one really agrees on what to eat. They're divided between moderates and progressives, and that internal divide can be brutal. On one side, you've got the moderates. These are your Joe Manchins, your Kirsten Sinemas, the folks who represent swing states or more conservative districts. They're all about cautious, incremental change. They don't want to rock the boat too much because their voters aren't on board with extreme policies. For them, it's about survival, staying in office by appealing to the center or even the right. Manchin, for example, represents West Virginia, a deep red state where Trump won by nearly 40 points in 2020. So when the Democrats push for things like sweeping climate legislation or Medicare for all, Manchin has to ask himself, can I vote for this and still keep my seat? That's why he tends to be a roadblock on progressive ideas. He's thinking about survival in a red state, not necessarily the broader democratic agenda. Then on the other side of the spectrum, you've got the progressives, people like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Bernie Sanders, and Elizabeth Warren. These folks aren't interested in making small tweaks or cautious reforms. They're pushing for big transformative changes, things like the Green New Deal, free college, and universal healthcare. They believe the old system is broken, and the only way to fix it is by pushing the envelope. For them, the stakes are too high to go slow. This internal divide creates a tug of war every time when the Democrats try to pass major legislation. The moderates want to slow things down, avoid controversy, and make sure they don't alienate voters in conservative areas. The progressives, they want to push forward no matter the risk. And when the party can't find common ground, it leads to gridlock before they even have to deal with the Republican opposition. That's why you'll often hear terms like Democrats in disarray. It's not that they don't want to get things done, it's that they can't agree on what to get done or how fast to do it. Now, if you've been following politics for a while, you've probably heard this word 1,000 times. Filibuster. Sounds boring, right? But trust me, this little Senate rule is a huge deal. And it's part of the reason the Democrats struggle to push through their agenda, even when technically they have control. In the Senate, to pass most big pieces of legislation, you don't just need a majority, you need 60 votes. Yeah, 60. And right now, the Democrats have 50 seats, plus the vice president's tiebreaker. So they basically need to convince 10 Republicans to cross the aisle, which, let's be real, happens almost never. If they can't do that, the bill is dead on arrival. So even when the Democrats technically control the Senate, they're trapped by the 60-vote rule. The filibuster is like this invisible hand that blocks anything bold from getting through. We live in a time of extreme polarization, where Republicans are rarely willing to cross the aisle, especially on high-profile issues. Now, some Democrats have called for abolishing this filibuster altogether. They argue that it's an outdated rule that's being abused to block progress. After all, the filibuster wasn't even part of original constitution. It was a rule that evolved over time, and in the modern era, it's been weaponized to block any major reforms wanting to be done. But here's where it gets tricky. Remember those moderate Democrats we talked about earlier? People like Joe Manchin are actually against getting rid of the filibuster. They believe it protects minority rights in the Senate and prevents drastic swings in policy every time control of Congress flips. In other words, they see it as a safeguard against extreme partisanship. So even though some Democrats want to scrap the filibuster and pass bold reforms with a simple majority, others within the party are standing in the way. And without a unified front, the filibuster remains, acting like a giant speed bump for democratic legislation. Now let's shift our focus to the Republicans, because they play a big role in this story too. And let's be honest, Republican opposition is fierce. But here's the thing, it's not just about Republicans blocking democratic ideas because they disagree with the policies. This is about strategy. It's political chess, and the Republicans are very good at it. For Republicans, blocking democratic legislation isn't just about stopping specific bills, it's about making the Democrats look ineffective. Think about it. If the Democrats have control of the Congress and the White House, but they can't pass their key priorities, it sends a message to voters that maybe the Democrats aren't capable of governing. That's a big win for Republicans, especially heading into this next election cycle. Take Mitch McConnell, for example. He's often referred to as a master tactician in Washington, and he's made it clear that his goal is to block as much of Democratic agenda as possible. Remember, when he famously said his top priority was making Obama a one-term president, well, that approach hasn't changed much. Whether it's procedural delays, endless debates, or blocking judicial nominations, McConnell knows how to grind the legislative process to a halt. And Republicans use these tactics not just to block legislation, but to control the public narrative. When Democrats can't deliver on their promises, Republicans swoop in with the argument that the Democrats are incompetent. And in today's fast-paced media environment, that message sticks. So even when the Democrats have control on paper, they're playing a game of political chess against an opponent who's willing to use every tool at their disposal to stop them. But here's a twist you might not expect. It's not always Republicans blocking the Democrats. Sometimes it's Democrats blocking the Democrats. Confused? Let's break it down. In the Democratic Party, not all senators represent deep blue states like California or New York. Some come from swing states or even red states, where their voters aren't exactly progressive. Think about Joe Manchin in West Virginia or Kyrsten Sinema in Arizona. These are states where Trump won and where voters are generally more conservative. For Democrats in these states, pushing too far to the left is a political suicide. They know that if they vote for something like Medicare for all or a massive climate bill, their voters back home might turn against them, and in the next election they could lose their seat, and with it the Democrats could lose control of the Senate. Take Manchin for example. He's voted against some key Democratic priorities, not because he's a closet Republican, but because he's trying to keep his seat in a state where being too progressive could cost him his job. He's walking a tightrope, balancing the demands of his party with the realities of his conservative-leaning voters. So even when the Democrats try to pass big-ticket items, they have to navigate these internal dynamics. They can't just assume they'll get all 50 Democratic votes, because some of their own members are afraid that backing progressive policies will hurt them back home. It's a classic case of self-preservation. Now, let's get real about something that plays a huge role in why the Democrats often struggle to get things done. Money. More specifically, the influence of lobbying and special interests in Washington, D.C. Here's how it works. In theory, our elected officials are supposed to represent us, the people. But in reality, a lot of the time, they're listening to the voices of corporate lobbyists and special interest groups. People who have the money and resources to influence lawmakers behind the scenes. These groups spend billions of dollars every year to shape policy in their favor. And make no mistake, This money flows to both sides of the political aisle, including the Democrats. Let's break down how this plays out. Take healthcare, for example. When the Democrats talk about lowering prescription drug prices or expanding access to Medicare, it sounds like common sense, right? After all, these policies are wildly popular with the American public, but behind the scenes, the pharmaceutical industry is fighting tooth and nail to prevent any changes that might hurt their profits. Pharma companies spend millions of dollars every year on lobbying. They hire armies of lobbyists, often former members of Congress or their staff, to wine and dine lawmakers, whisper in their ears, and craft policy that works for the drug companies, not the patients. They donate to campaigns, both directly and through super PACs, political action committees, ensuring that key legislators are incentivized to protect their interests. If we look at climate change, this is one area where progressive Democrats are really pushing for aggressive action. The Green New Deal, for example, is one of the most ambitious climate proposals in history. It calls for massive investments in renewable energy, infrastructure upgrades, and transitioning away from fossil fuels. Every time Democrats try to pass meaningful climate legislation, the fossil fuel industry steps in to block it. Big oil, gas companies, and coal producers have a vested interest in keeping the status quo. These industries are some of the biggest spenders in Washington, pouring millions into lobbying efforts to kill or weaken climate bills. They've been at it for decades, donating to lawmakers who protect their interests. This is often why we see even Democrats voting against bold climate action. They're getting pressure not just from voters, but from an entire industry that's hell-bent on slowing progress. And we can't forget corporate America more broadly. When Democrats talk about taxing the rich, regulating big tech, or strengthening labor unions, they're going up against some of the wealthiest, most powerful companies in the world. Companies like Amazon, Facebook, and Goldman Sachs. These corporations don't just rely on lobbying, they donate huge sums to political campaigns, fund think tanks that promote their interests, and hire former lawmakers to advocate on their behalf. This influence extends to both parties, but it can be especially tricky for Democrats. Many Democratic lawmakers rely on corporate donations to fund their re-election campaigns, which makes it difficult for them to push for aggressive economic reforms that would hurt their donors' bottom lines. So when we talk about Democrats' struggle to get things done, we can't ignore the massive role that money plays in shaping policy. Special interests and lobbying groups that don't just influence what gets passed, they influence what gets talked about, what's prioritized, and what's compromised. Last but not least, let's talk about messaging. This is something that doesn't get nearly enough attention, but it's a big part of why the Democrats struggle to push their agenda. Here's the problem. The Democrats often have big, complex ideas, healthcare reform, climate change action, tax reform, but they struggle to communicate those ideas in a simple, compelling way. They get bogged down in the details and policy jargon, and that doesn't always connect with voters. Contrast that with the Republicans, who are masters of messaging. They come up with short, punchy slogans that are easy to understand and repeat.
We will make America powerful again. We will make America wealthy again. We will make America strong again. We will make America proud again. We will make America safe again. And we will make America great again.
These phrases are simple, memorable, and they stick. People may not know all the details, but they know what the Republicans are about. Meanwhile, Democrats are out here trying to explain complicated policy proposals like the Affordable Care Act or the Green New Deal, and it just doesn't resonate with voters in the same way. In today's fast-paced media landscape, where attention spans are short, simple messaging wins. The Democrats' failure to communicate their policies clearly means that they often lose the public narrative, even when they have good ideas. And when they lose the public, it becomes that much harder to build the momentum they need to pass legislation. So why do Democrats struggle to get things done? It's a combination of factors. Internal divisions, the filibuster, Republican obstruction, swing state dilemmas, the power of money in politics, and weak messaging. It's a complex web of challenges that all adds up to one thing: gridlock. What do you think? Will the Democrats break through the gridlock? Let us know in the comments. The real question is, can they find a way to overcome these challenges and deliver on their promises in the future? Only time will tell.